Why is it that, after a so-called spiritual awakening, life can feel empty? You thought things would finally make sense. You expected more peace, more joy, more direction. Instead, the drive is gone. The things that used to excite you now feel meaningless. The ambitions that once lit a fire in your chest now leave you cold. There's no desire to achieve, no motivation to keep playing the game. And no one talks about this part, the spiritual crash that comes after the awakening. Dr. Gabor Maté, known for his powerful insights into trauma and the human condition, points to something few dare to admit: that spiritual awakening can unearth deep, unresolved pain, and strip away the very things that once made us feel alive. But this loss isn't the end. It may be the beginning of something more real. Let's explore this uncomfortable, sacred terrain together. There's a moment after the veil lifts when the world feels quieter, but not in a peaceful way. It feels hollow. The beliefs that once held your life together no longer make sense. The roles you played, the achiever, the parent, the partner, the spiritual seeker, begin to dissolve. You see through the illusions, the conditioning, the constant striving, and with that clarity comes loss. Not the loss of something material, but of meaning. This is the paradox. Spiritual awakening can bring a kind of internal death, not dramatic or theatrical, but subtle, creeping, existential. The things that used to give you purpose, your job, your goals, your self-image, now seem constructed, arbitrary, like you were playing a part in a drama you no longer believe in. Many describe this phase as a kind of spiritual depression, but that doesn't quite capture it. It's not just sadness, it's a flatness, a sense that motivation itself has evaporated, and it's terrifying, not because you're broken, but because you've outgrown the fuel that used to drive you. This is where Dr. Gabor Maté's work intersects in a profound way. He reminds us that we often build our motivations, especially our achievements, as coping mechanisms. To feel worthy, to stay safe, to stay busy. And when those fall away, we come face to face with our unhealed wounds. And yet, this emptiness is not a sign of failure. It's a sacred pause, a confrontation with the truth beneath all you're doing. Who are you now that you're no longer who you were? That's where we begin. There's something most people don't realize until they've crossed the threshold of awakening. Much of what drove you before wasn't really you. The urgency to succeed, the desire to be seen, admired, validated, the hunger to prove your worth, even to yourself. It felt like purpose. It looked like ambition. But in truth, it was often survival. Dr. Gabor Maté speaks frequently about how trauma shapes personality, not just in the dramatic ways, addiction, illness, anxiety, but in subtle ones too, like becoming the overachiever, the helper, the perfectionist, or the spiritual seeker who runs from pain by dressing it up in enlightenment. So when awakening happens, when the curtain is pulled back, those false selves begin to fall apart. The motivation you once had begins to die, and with it, a part of you dies too. This is why it feels so disorienting. You're not just losing drive. You're losing the identity that needed that drive in the first place. Maybe you used to push yourself through 12-hour workdays, or chase one spiritual workshop after another, or obsess over self-improvement books, constantly tweaking, fixing, performing, and now you don't care anymore, and you judge yourself for that. You wonder if you're becoming lazy, apathetic, lost. But what if you're just shedding the armor? What if the lack of motivation is a sign that you've stopped running? The part of you that used to fight for love, for success, for approval, maybe that part is finally exhausted, and maybe that exhaustion is grace in disguise. Because beneath the illusion of your old motivations, there is something raw, real, waiting. Not a performance, not a mask, but a desire that isn't rooted in fear. To get there, you may have to walk through the desert of not knowing, of not wanting anything at all. This is not regression, it's a return. Not all wounds bleed, not all traumas scream. Some are woven so deeply into our way of being that we call them personality. Or worse, we call them spirituality. Dr. Gabor Maté has spent decades uncovering the subtle ways trauma shapes not only our behavior, but our very sense of self. And one of the most painful truths he brings forward is this: trauma is not what happens to you. It's what happens inside you as a result of what happens to you. Now pause with that for a moment. Because when we apply this to the spiritual path, especially for those who've awakened, we begin to see something deeply unsettling. Many people pursue awakening not as a genuine calling of the soul, but as a subconscious escape from pain, from emptiness, from disconnection, from unresolved childhood wounds that never had a voice. And here's the paradox: awakening, when it's real, doesn't let you bypass that pain. It delivers you straight to it. This is where motivation often collapses, because for the first time, there's no performance to hide behind, no spiritual persona, no mission, just you, raw, unprotected, and face-to-face with the trauma that drove you all along. Maybe it was the deep belief that you're not enough, that love had to be earned, that rest was dangerous, that being still meant being abandoned. These internal messages, planted in early formative years, become the scaffolding of our adult motivation. We move, we strive, we create, we serve. But so often, we do it to stay ahead of our pain, and when awakening strips that scaffolding away, we meet the invisible trauma of the spirit. This is not the dramatic trauma of war, abuse, or catastrophe. It's the quiet trauma of disconnection, from the body, from emotion, from self. Dr. Maté teaches that healing comes not from fixing ourselves, but from reconnecting, from allowing what was exiled in us to come home. But here's the truth: reconnection requires stillness, and stillness can feel unbearable when we've spent a lifetime in motion. So if you've lost motivation, it may not be a sign that you've failed. It may be the first sign that your nervous system is coming out of hypervigilance, that your soul is asking to feel, not flee. There's a quiet grief that no one prepares you for, the moment you realize you no longer enjoy the things that once brought you comfort. Music doesn't move you. Food tastes dull. Even nature, the wind, the trees, the sun on your skin, feels distant. You sit in a cafe you once loved, holding a cup of coffee that used to feel sacred. And now? Nothing. Just a blankness. This is one of the most confusing and painful parts of post-awakening life, because joy doesn't just vanish, it fades, slowly, like color draining from a photograph. And it leaves behind a quiet question: what's wrong with me? Dr. Gabor Maté often speaks of how trauma separates us from presence, but there's another, more subtle separation that happens after awakening, the separation from pleasure itself. Why? Because much of what we once enjoyed was entangled with our old identity, the self that was driven, hungry, seeking. That joy, in many ways, was transactional. We felt good when we achieved. We felt connected when we were praised. We felt relaxed when we deserved it. But now, the performance is gone. The illusion of effort, worth, has cracked. And in the quiet that remains, you're left face to face with a strange, sterile stillness, like your senses have gone numb. This is what makes people panic. They think they're depressed, broken, done. But here's another possibility. You are not broken. You are detoxing. You're detoxing from years, maybe decades of stimulation, of adrenaline, of living outside yourself. And like any detox, there's a period where everything feels worse before it feels real. Dr. Maté would call this the withdrawal from false self-regulation, the kind that comes from external validation and internal pressure. You're no longer chasing what kept you afloat. And now, your system is relearning how to feel joy that isn't tied to performance. This phase requires patience. Because the new joy, the quiet, grounded, genuine joy, is slower, softer, less flashy, and it comes not from doing, but from being. It may return in a breath, a glance, the way light hits a wall, the stillness of a Sunday morning. But first, you must let yourself grieve the loss of the old joy, the artificial joy, the joy that once kept the pain at bay. That grief is part of your healing. Just when you think you've left the ego behind, it changes costumes. No longer the achiever, no longer the people-pleaser. Now, it becomes the awakened one, subtle, sophisticated, righteous, and just as hungry for control. Dr. Gabor Maté often reminds us that the ego is not bad. It's a defense, a structure built to protect the wounded inner child. And after awakening, that child is still there, still tender, still needing to feel safe, seen, and held. So, what does the ego do? It adapts. It takes on the role of the spiritual person, the conscious one, the mindful, non-attached, high-vibrational identity. And at first, it feels like growth. You meditate, you eat clean, you use the right words, you detach from drama, you feel superior, but in a loving way. Until one day, it all feels empty again. Because beneath the surface, the new spiritual ego is still running on fear. Fear of falling back asleep. Fear of being unconscious. Fear of being ordinary. And so begins the next trap. The endless seeking. You chase retreats, teachers, books, certifications, shadow work, inner child healing, integration workshops, more breath work, more mantras, more surrender. But in secret, you're exhausted, because it's not healing anymore. It's performing. And what's worse, you feel ashamed that you feel this way, ashamed that your higher self is still so tired, so lonely, so human. This is where Gabor Maté's voice cuts through with quiet clarity. The attempt to be good is often the most sophisticated defense of the wounded self. Even, our spirituality can become an armor, and here's the hardest truth. Sometimes what we call a lack of motivation is actually the soul saying, stop pretending, stop fixing, stop striving to be better, purer, higher. Just be here. Even if here is a mess, even if it's ordinary, even if you don't feel awake or inspired or guided. The real awakening might not be in becoming more. It might be in allowing yourself to be exactly as you are, without agenda. No masks, no roles, no pressure to be beyond pain. Because maybe, just maybe, that's what wholeness actually looks like. There comes a moment on the path, not glamorous, not Instagram-worthy, where everything goes quiet. No signs, no clarity, no breakthroughs, just stillness. At first, it feels like nothing is happening, but in truth, everything is being rearranged. Dr. Gabor Maté speaks of how our nervous system, after years of activation, needs deep regulation, not through effort, but through safety. And sometimes the soul knows what the mind resists. Healing doesn't always look like movement. Sometimes it looks like stopping. For the awakened person, this pause can feel unbearable, especially if you've lived your whole life in motion, doing, proving, fixing, growing. Suddenly, you have no desire to read another book, no energy for another inner journey, no interest in working on yourself, and that terrifies you. You ask, have I lost my way? Am I regressing? Is this depression? But what if this isn't a collapse? What if it's integration? The soul, like the body, needs rest after expansion. Not everything must be digested in motion. Not every insight needs to be turned into action. There is wisdom in winter, in letting the inner ground lie fallow. This is the sacred interval, the necessary silence between the old self dying and the new self forming. You're not meant to plant seeds in this season. You're meant to be still enough to feel the subtle roots growing beneath the surface. But this silence can trigger old wounds, especially if your worth was tied to productivity, if your sense of self was built on usefulness, if quiet once meant danger. That's why this phase can feel like death, because in many ways it is. The death of the self who could only exist through doing. The self who feared emptiness. Gabor Maté reminds us that our most profound transformation often happens in the absence of external markers. It happens when we allow the nervous system to not perform for once. So if you find yourself in this interval, where motivation has vanished, where goals feel meaningless, take heart. You are not broken. You are becoming. The silence is not the void. It's the womb. There's a romanticized version of awakening out there, polished and packaged. You open your eyes. You feel one with the universe. You radiate love, peace, and clarity. You finally know your purpose. But for many, maybe for you, awakening didn't feel like light. It felt like loss, disorientation, tears at 3 a.m., a strange hollowness that crept in when the illusions fell away. This is the side no one puts on a vision board, because the truth is, awakening breaks things. It breaks the roles you clung to. It breaks the beliefs that kept you safe. It breaks the stories you told yourself about who you were and why you mattered. Dr. Gabor Maté often warns that we should not confuse awakening with feeling better. True healing, he says, often brings us closer to our pain, not further from it. And here's the core of it. Awakening is not a reward. It's a reckoning. You begin to see how much of your life was built on survival, on adaptations that no longer serve your deeper self. You realize how much energy you spent staying busy, so you wouldn't feel what was beneath the surface. You start to feel grief, but you don't know why. Anger, but it has no target. Sadness, but it's not depression. It's something older, something truer. It's the pain of waking up to a world that no longer fits, and a self you're only just beginning to meet. This is the uncomfortable truth. Not every awakening is beautiful, but every honest one is necessary. The no motivation you feel? That's not laziness. It's the body, heart, and soul refusing to participate in a life that no longer feels real. And until something more authentic emerges, there may be a void, not as punishment, but as preparation, a clearing, a stripping away, a sacred undoing. Because only when the false has burned can the true begin to rise. What no one tells you is that spiritual awakening is a kind of death, and like any death, it demands grief. But this grief is elusive. It's not about a person, a place, or a moment. It's the sorrow of losing who you thought you were. The E, career-driven self, the endlessly helpful self, the spiritual warrior, the fixer, the seeker, the one who always had a plan. All gone, and in the silence that follows a strange ache rises, not for what you've lost, but for the you who no longer exists. Dr. Gabor Maté speaks of trauma not only as what happens to us, but as what we lose in ourselves to survive. But there's a mirror truth here too. Awakening is the moment you realize how much of you was built for survival, and how little of that self can come with you into what's real. And so, you grieve. You grieve the old motivations that once made you feel important. You grieve the clarity that came from chasing goals, even if those goals were never yours. You grieve the comfort of being asleep to deeper truths. And beneath it all, you grieve something even more primal, the loss of identity as security. Because who are you now, when you're no longer the helper, the achiever, the awakened one? You are untethered, and that's terrifying. But here's the medicine. Grief is not a weakness, it's a bridge. Grieving the lost self creates space for the true self to begin taking root. And this grief is sacred. It's intelligent. It knows how to move through you, not to paralyze, but to purify. You may find yourself crying without reason, feeling heavy for days, unable to explain what's happening to anyone, not even yourself. Trust it. This is not regression. This is your inner world, mourning what can no longer continue. You are not broken. You are in between, and in this liminal space, something softer begins to emerge, a version of you not defined by trauma, performance, or approval. But to meet that self, you must first say goodbye to who you were taught to be. Let yourself mourn. It's not the end. It's the beginning of something far more honest. After the storm, after the stripping, after the silence, something unexpected happens. You begin to notice small things. The way sunlight moves across your living room floor, the quiet rhythm of your breath while doing the dishes, the sound of birds at 5 a.m., not as background noise but as something sacred. This is the beginning of return. Not a return to who you were, that self is gone, but a return to life itself, unfiltered, undramatic, undecorated. For so long, you searched for meaning in the grand, the mystical, the transcendent. You chased peak experiences, revelations, signs from the universe. But now, meaning finds you in the ordinary. And this, says Dr. Gabor Maté, is often the most healing phase of all, because trauma disconnects us from presence, from the body, from the moment, from simplicity. So healing isn't about ascending higher, it's about descending back into your life, one quiet breath at a time. For those who've awakened, this return to the ordinary can feel almost disappointing. Where's the ecstasy, the clarity, the cosmic download? But something deeper is happening now. You are beginning to belong again, not to a concept, not to a path, but to your own existence. You no longer need to escape through productivity or spirituality. You no longer need your life to impress or inspire. You simply want to be with it, to cook a meal, to walk without needing it to be mindful, to laugh without analyzing why, to cry without fixing it. This is real freedom, not the freedom to do anything, but the freedom to be with everything as it is. Gabor Maté reminds us, the return to presence is not a mental act. It's a nervous system slowly learning that this moment is safe enough to live in. You are not going backward. You are grounding. You are learning to stand, barefoot and imperfect, in a life that no longer needs to be extraordinary to be meaningful. And in that return, motivation, desire, and even joy may begin to rise again, but not from fear, not from pressure, from love. When the dust settles, and it will, something quiet but unmistakable begins to stir inside you, not urgency, not ambition, not pressure to prove or achieve, but a gentle pull, a longing, not to be somebody, but to live in alignment with something deeper, older, and finally true. This is motivation after awakening. Not a drive from the ego, but a movement from the soul. It's not about chasing success or even serving the world. It's about being honest with what genuinely wants to come through you. Dr. Gabor Maté speaks of authenticity as a basic human need, as essential as food or oxygen. And now, after everything has been stripped away, you begin to feel that need rise again. But this time, it comes without a mask. Maybe you find yourself drawn to something simple: gardening, painting, caring, writing, building something with your hands. Not to impress, not to monetize, just because it brings you alive. Maybe you feel the desire to reconnect, not through roles, but through presence, to love without rescuing, to listen without fixing, to show up without performing. This is the new motivation. Rooted not in what the world expects of you, but in what your soul longs to express, and it doesn't always feel productive. Sometimes it looks like rest. Sometimes it sounds like no. Sometimes it feels like starting over, slowly, without fanfare. And that's okay. Because now, there's no more race, no more arrival. There is only this unfolding, moment by moment, as you rediscover what matters now that the noise is gone. You are not here to be motivated by fear anymore. Not by duty. Not by the need to be enough. You are here to let what is real in you have a voice. And sometimes that voice will whisper, "Do nothing today." Other times it will say, "Speak, create, rebuild," but always it will come from wholeness. Not lack. This is the gift on the other side of losing your motivation. You didn't lose it. You shed what was false so you could remember what was yours all along.